Hi everyone! Today we're going to do some modeling again, and we're going to practice subdivision surface modeling, and we will create a wooden stool. I've discovered a new website which is called craftsmanspace.com. I will post a link to that website in the video description, and on this website you can get a number of free plans for creating wooden objects, and one of them is this stool here. And if you open that website and scroll down a bit, you can see some images, and here at the bottom you can download a PDF plan, and you can download a zip file that contains some high-res images from that PDF plan. In this tutorial we'll be working with the high-res images. In the video description you can also find a download link to some project files. I've prepared 3 of those files for you. This wooden stool consists of 3 parts. One of them is the boards, the second one is the pins, and the third one is the legs. Each of the project files contains a reference image that we can use for modeling, and I've already set the reference images up so we can model this object to scale. However, we can only be so accurate because we're using subdivision surfaces, and when you use subdivision surfaces your objects will shrink just a little bit. And that means that our finished model will not be 100% accurate. In the tutorial I'm going to use a couple of plugins. One is the HB modeling bundle, and the other one is the CAD Deformer pack by Curious Animal. I'm going to use that plugin for modeling part of the leg. If you don't have that plugin, you don't need to worry, because the leg start file contains the object you can use to follow this tutorial. I'm also going to post links to the HB modeling bundle and the CAD Deformer pack, just in case you want to have a look at those plugins. We're going to start the model by creating what is called the boards, and then we will be modeling the pins, and the final object will be the legs. And then we will put all of those objects into a single file and assemble the wooden stool. So this is the finished object. And here you can see a wireframe render of this object. I hope you'll enjoy this tutorial. Once you've downloaded the project files, we can get started. The first object we'll be modeling is the board, which is this part here. And if you take a look at this image here you can see the dimensions of the board. It is 216 by 216 millimeters. The numbers in brackets here are the numbers in inches, so if you prefer to work with inches you can do that. Over here you can see that this board has a height of 22 millimeters, and we also have beveled edges here which are 5 millimeters, and we have these cut corners here. And on these corners we have holes, and this is where the pins go in. And these holes have a diameter of 12 millimeters and they are 26.5 millimeters deep. If you open the board start file, you can find the reference image in the top view. I've already scaled it so it matches the proportions. Let's go to the viewport settings by hitting Shift V on the keyboard. And if you go to the back tab, you can make changes to the reference image. In this case I'm going to rotate it 45 degrees. And the board is pretty simple. We can start this with a cube, and I'm going to make this 216 by 22 by 216 millimeters. And I'm going to add a segment on the X and on the Z axis. If I hit NH, I can go to wireframe mode so I can see the edges here. Let's go ahead and make that cube editable. Let's rename this to board. And let's go to the top view, switch to point mode, and delete all of these points here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add that cut corner. You can see in the reference image that the distance between the corner and the cut corner is 20.5 millimeters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ring select these edges and use connect points edges. And then I'm going to select these edges, move my axis over to -100%, and I'm going to change the size to 20.5 millimeters. And we need to do the same thing on this side here. And here I'm going to move the Z-axis all the way over. Let's select all of these edges, and I'm going to change the size to 20.5 millimeters. And let's reset everything here. And I'm going to select these points here, switch on snapping, and I'm going to snap these points to this point, deselect all the points, and optimize the object. I think I'll also make this image a little more transparent. So now we can select these edges here and dissolve them, and I'm also going to dissolve this edge and the one at the bottom. So now we have something that only consists of quads. Next I'm going to add the bevel to the edges over here and over here. And if you take another look at this image here, you can see that the cut corners are actually not beveled. So we only need to bevel the edges over here and over here. Let's bring out the bevel tool, and we need an offset of 5 millimeters. And we need to do a chamfer and not a solid bevel. And you can see what happens is this. We're also getting an additional corner here, which is not what I want. And the reason why this happens is this edge here and this one here at the bottom. In order to make it possible to bevel these edges, I'm just going to dissolve these edges for now. And then we can select these edges and try beveling again. And this time everything should work. Before I put that hole in there, I'm going to add the control edges. So let's go ahead and do that. What I'll do is, in edge mode, I'm going to deselect all the edges and then use the funk break selection. Select all of the edges, and I'm going to bevel those. And for these I'm going to do an offset of maybe 1.5, and we need to switch that to solid. And now we have something like this. And before I put that hole in there, I'm going to remove the N-gon at the top, and I'm going to do that with a knife tool. I'm going to switch off visible only, snap to this point here, and make a cut to here. Okay, so we have these edges back. And in order to get that hole in there, we need some additional edges. I want one that goes through the center of that hole here, and we also need to add an edge at the center of the hole here. So I'm going to ring select these edges here and connect them, and I'm going to ring select these edges and connect them as well. And now we need to count the edges. So if I select all of these, you can see that we have 12 edges, and that's the number of rotation segments that we need for our cylinder. So let's go ahead and add a cylinder, and we need a radius of 6 millimeters. Let's switch that to -Z, and I'm going to rotate that 45 degrees. And we also need to change the rotation segments to 12. And now we can put the board in a bool object at the cylinder. And you can see the geometry looks a little bit messy. So what I'll do is, first of all, I'll create a single object, but I'm also going to hide the new edges. Let's make this editable and rename it to board. Let's get rid of that selection tag. And in point mode, I'm going to remove the N-gons by selecting 2 points like this and using connect points edges. And I'm going to close this polygon hole here. And let's go ahead and connect these 2 points. And I'm going to make a cut here, here, and here to get rid of the n-gons. And now we can select these polygons here and extrude them back. And we need an offset of minus 26.5 millimeters. Let's go to edge mode. I'm going to select these edges here and I'm going to add the control edges. Let's do a solid bevel again, and I'll reduce the offset to maybe 1 millimeter. That should be enough. Let's go ahead and put this in a subdivision surface object and see how that looks. And I think that's pretty good. The only thing I want to change is I want to add a little bit of geometry. So I'm going to ring select these edges and use edge cut, and let's do maybe 3 or 4 subdivisions. I don't want to go too high. And over here I'm also going to add 4 edge loops like this. So now we have an object that has pretty even geometry, well, at least in the bigger areas here. Let's go ahead and put this in a symmetry object. Actually, we need 2. Let's switch the second one to XY. Make this editable. And there we go, that is our finished board. I'll just rename the subdivision surface object to board. And there we go, that's our first object finished. Let's move on and model the pin. In this reference image here, you can see that the cylinder part of the pin has a length of 60.5 millimeters, and over here you can see that the diameter is 12 millimeters, and the diameter of the sphere on top of that cylinder has a diameter of 22 millimeters. If you open the pin start file, you will again have a reference image in the top view, and again I have this already scaled to the dimensions that we need. Let's start with the cylinder part. And we can use a cylinder for that, of course. The radius for this needs to be 6 millimeters because we have a diameter of 12. And let's go ahead and change the orientation to +X. And we need to change the length to, what was that again? 60.5 millimeters. I don't want any caps for this cylinder, so I'm going to switch those off. And as for the rotation segments, I'm going to use 12. I've just switched to wireframe mode by hitting NH. So that's all we need to do for this part of the object. Next we're going to create the sphere or the head of this pin, and I'm not going to use a sphere for that. And the reason for that is if I add one to the scene and if I reduce the segments to 12, which means that I should get the edges that match the number of edges that we have on our cylinder here, we're getting a very low res sphere. And the problem with a sphere is that we can change the amount of segments, but we cannot control the horizontal edges separately. So that's one reason that I don't want to use a sphere here. Also, since we're going to use subdivision surfaces, I want everything to be quads, but I don't want to use the hexahedron sphere either. Because of the topology, it's not going to look really spherical. So what I'll use instead is a capsule. So let's go ahead and add one to the scene. And I'm going to change the radius of this to 11 millimeters. and let's do a height of maybe 50 for now. Hit S to center the object here, and let me just check the reference image. 22 millimeters is the diameter, so a radius of 11 millimeters is perfect. We don't need any height segments, so we can switch those to 1. And the nice thing about the capsule is that we can change the rotation segments just like we could on the sphere, but we have separate control over the cap segments. So if I would use a sphere, I would get something like this, but I want something a little more high res. Let's do 4 or 5 of those segments. Let's try 4. And I'm going to switch the orientation to +X. And let's go ahead and make this editable. And we can delete all of the points here. I'm going to move the axis over. I'll just use enable axis here and snapping, and I'll move the axis and snap it to here, and then I'm going to snap it to the top of the cylinder. Now the only thing that I don't like is the pole here. And I'm going to get rid of that by deleting this point, and then I'm going to use another plugin which is called Nitro Cap by Nitro 4D, and I'm going to close that hole here, and it's going to create quads. And let's see, maybe I could turn this around. It doesn't really matter, I think. Maybe we could rotate this entire thing here, but it's not really necessary. Let's keep it like that. I'll just select this polygon here at the front, and I'm going to move it forward a little bit to create a rounding here. And if I put that in a subdivision surface object, it should look fine. Okay, so that's good. Let's go ahead and close that polygon hole at the back, and I'm going to select the n-gon here and use extrude inner. And we need a radius that matches the radius of the cylinder. So I'm going to do, what was that again? 12. So the diameter is 12. Let's change that. And we should get matching geometry. Let's go ahead and delete the n-gon. And then we can select both of these objects, right click and select connect objects and delete. Optimize the object. I'm also going to close that polygon hole here at the back. Select this n-gon, use extrude inner, hold down Control, left click on points to turn this into a point selection, and then I'm going to weld all of these points. Next, in edge mode, I'm going to do a funk break selection. I'm going to select all the edges, and let's do a solid bevel here, and 1 millimeter should be enough. Let's go ahead and subdivide this, and that is looking pretty good. I'll just undo that. And I'm going to add a couple of edge loops in between here just to avoid the distortion and in order to hold that shape a little bit better. If you add a subdivision surface object, you can see we're getting some weird shading here. And that's because we have such a big distance between the edges. You can see when I add the subdivision surface, the control edge that's supposed to be here is dragged all the way over to here. And the same is happening for this edge over here. So let me just undo that. I'm using edge cut, and let's add a couple of subdivisions here. Maybe not too many. Let's do 6 or 7, that should be enough. And let's test that again with a subdivision surface object. And that is looking a lot better, I think. Maybe I will add a couple of more. Okay. So that is our pin. And that's the second object. Next we're going to do the leg. The last object we need is the leg. And you can see in this image how this leg looks. If you take a look at the other references, like this one, you can see that this leg has a height of 476 millimeters. And down here you can see that it is 35 by 35 millimeters. Here at the top, here and here at the bottom. And we have holes in this area and this area, and these holes need to have a diameter of 12 millimeters because we need to be able to fit our pin in there. If you open the leg start file, you will already find an object in there. I'm using a plugin to create the first part of the object, and if you don't have that plugin, you don't need to buy it. You can start with the object that you will find in this scene file. The area we're going to start with is this one here, because it's the most difficult one. If you take a look at the image here, you can see we have this rounded off top and bottom, and this area here will be a little bit tricky. We also have bevels here on the corners, and we're going to do those as well. And the way I'm going to do this is by using a plane as a starting point, and I'll make this 35 by 35 millimeters. And I don't want a whole lot of subdivisions, so I'm going to bring those down to 4 by 4. And in order to get that shape here, I'm going to add the sphere wrap deformer from the cat deformer pack by Curious Animal, and I'll make this a child. And by default this object is pretty big, and you can see our plane is very small up there. What I'll do is I'll scale that sphere wrap deformer down. And let's go ahead and move that object up. I need to select the plane to move this around. And then we can adjust the settings here. I think I need to scale this down a little bit further. And let's move this back up again. And then we just need to play around with the settings. Let's see, I'll bring this down to maybe 23 here. Let's move this back up to about here. And actually this looks pretty good. Let's maybe scale this down a little bit more. So the points here are on the edges or on the corners of the drawing here. And I think I also need to move this drawing over a little bit. So I think something like this should be fine. I'm going to keep this as a backup and use current state to object, and I'll switch this off. So now we have this. What we can't do is move the points here on the corners down to match it up with the reference image, because if we do, we will get distorted geometry and non-planar polygons on the corners, and I don't want that. In order to get exactly the curve that you have in the reference image, you would have to use more geometry for the plane, but I don't want to do that because I don't want to make this like too high poly. So what I'll do next is I'll go to point mode and I'll select all the points and make sure these are 35 by 35. And then I'm going to select the points here, switch on enable axis, and I'll move the axis to this point, and I'll switch off enable axis, and then I'm going to scale these down to 0. And I'll do the same thing over here. And we also need to do this in the right view. And what I will try and do is select these points here and just move these down a little bit further to make the distances up here more even. And I think maybe I'll also move these points up a little bit further. Let's undo that. I'll try something else instead. Let's go to edge mode. I'll select these edges and I'm going to use a script from the HP modeling bundle called even distribution to space out these edges a little more evenly. And I have it mapped to a shortcut so I can do this more quickly. Maybe let's move this up a little bit further to about here. And I will try and select these points and move them up a little bit further. Something like this. Let's check those corners. We still have planar polygons, which is good. I'm going to loop select the edges on the outside, and then I'm going to extrude them down. And I'm going to scale them to 0. And I'll just move these down to about the center of that hole here. We also have these bevels on the corners, so I'm going to add those next. Let's go ahead and select the edges here. And I'm going to bevel these using an offset of maybe 1.5. And that means we're getting these n-gons here. Let's go ahead and remove those. I'm going to select the points here. And I'm going to use connect points edges. So this will give us quads here on the corners, and we have these triangles. And we're going to get rid of those in a second. Let's select these edges here. And I'm going to clone those. And let's use preserve curvature and clone. And I'm going to move these up to maybe about here. And then I'm going to hit UF, and now I can select the polygons here at the top. I'm going to scale these down to 0. And I'm going to melt them into an n-gon, and then hold down Control and left click on points to turn this into a point selection. And I'm going to use another script, which is a free one. It's called points to circle. And I'm going to scale these points down. We also need to move these down a little bit. So something like this actually looks pretty good. So we're back to all quads. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to add control edges for these areas here. And usually you would add control edges to the left and to the right, but this would make the geometry here very dense. And I think we can get away by adding the control edges only on those bigger areas here. I'm going to select the polygons all around the object except for the ones on the corner. And I'm going to use extrude inner. And let's do an offset of maybe 1 millimeter. And I'm going to make a cut here at the bottom, switch off visible only. And I'll select these points and delete them and move these ones down to the center of that hole. Next I'm going to extrude this n-gon here to create the shape of that leg. So let's hit D for extrude and then scale down a little bit. Extrude again. And let's go all the way to here maybe. And I'm going to extrude again and scale. We don't need to be too precise at the moment. When we subdivide this object, it will shrink a little bit because we're not using that much geometry. So we're going to have to scale many of these edge loops to get closer to the shape in the reference image. But for now, I'm just going to try and create the general shape. And here we can move these polygons up a little bit. If you take a closer look at this image, you will see that the shape that we've created now is exactly the same shape that we need up here, with the exception of that hole. So we can copy this geometry and use it for the top part of the leg. Now let's see. I'm going to put our object in a subdivision surface object, and let's select the plane. Actually, let's rename this to leg, and I'm going to call this leg 2. And let's see. Let's go ahead and select these points here, and I'm going to scale them and match them up with the lines in the reference image a little bit better. And I'm hitting the spacebar to switch between the live selection tool and the scale tool here. So the shape actually is not looking too bad. If I switch the subdivision surface off, down here we get a lot of distortion, and that's because we don't have any geometry in between these edges here and the ones down here. But if we add another cut here and subdivide that, we're getting a much more defined shape here. And let's see, maybe we could select these points, and we need to select the corresponding ones in the right view. And maybe let's move these up just a little bit, maybe even a little bit further. And that is looking a little bit nicer, I think. Let's continue scaling some of the points here. So I think that's looking pretty good. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close that hole down here. Or maybe not. Let's keep this the way it is. We could make a copy of this. We need to close that hole at the top, but down here we actually need that hole. Now what I'm going to do with that copy is I'm going to move the object axis to the top. And then I'm going to rotate this around 180 degrees. And let's have a look. You can see the edges are not really matching up here. let's go to edge mode. I'll just select the edges here and delete them. And then I'm going to select both of these objects and use connect objects and delete. And I'm going to select the edges up here and the ones down here. I need to delete that polygon up here. So let's select these two. It seems I didn't connect and delete them. And this one we can actually get rid of, I think. We have two of those. I'll just move this down. We can use this for the bottom shape. Right now let's deal with this one. So let's go back to edge mode. I'm going to select these edges here and then use stitch and sew. Hold down the shift key, left click and drag, and now these objects are connected. And I think I screwed something up here because that's still not how it should be. I'll just go back a few steps to the point where I made that mistake. So let's select these two objects, use connect objects and delete, and now we have only this one object here. And I'm going to delete that n-gon here and select these edges and the ones up here and use stitch and sew again to connect the geometry, and I'm going to dissolve these edges here. Okay, so that's looking good. Here at the top we need to close that polygon hole, and I'm going to select this n-gon and use extrude inner, and let's use this as the control edge. I'll do maybe 1 millimeter here. Well, let's do 1.5. And in point mode, I'm going to move some of these points just to space these edges apart a little bit better. And then I'm going to select these 2 points and use connect points edges. And I'm going to do that on the other 3 corners as well. And now we can also connect these points here. And all of these ones. And next I'm going to create some edges with a knife tool. Switch on visible only before you make the cuts. And there we go. So now we've removed all of the n-gons here. We also need to move these points up a little bit further. So I'm going to line these up with the reference image, and then I'm going to select the points at the top and just move them all the way up to here. And I'm going to make another cut about where this hole will be. And then I'm going to select all of these points, move my y-axis all the way to the top, and you can see the distance to the edge from the top edge of the object to the center of the hole is 19 millimeters. So let's change the size to 19. Let's go ahead and reset the axis. And I'm also going to select these edges and bevel them, and let's use an offset of maybe 10 here with one subdivision, and this will create the geometry that we need to put that hole in there. And we could also add a control edge or control edges up here. And I should have switched on or switched off visible only. So I'll just undo that and make that cut again. Okay, and that is looking a little bit better. And something went wrong when I beveled the edges as well. Let's go ahead and just dissolve all of these again. Let's make another cut. I think it was because I had switched visible only on. So let's select these edges here. I'll just move the axis again to the top and change the size to 19 millimeters. Okay, so now that is looking a little bit better. And let's go ahead and bevel these edges here. Let's just make sure that I selected all of the edges. Same settings as before, 10 millimeters with one subdivision. So now we have the geometry that we need to create that hole later. Okay, so let's continue down here. Here at the bottom, at least part of the shape is the same as it is up here. So what I'll do here is I'll just select these polygons here, and I'm going to split these off. And for this new object, I'm going to move the object axis to the bottom and rotate it 180 degrees. And we can select both of these and use connect objects and delete. And for now, I'm just going to dissolve these edges here, which isn't working for some reason. Let's take a look, maybe the edges are not matching up. I just deleted these edges. And I'm going to select these ones and use stitch and sew to create the geometry in between. Let's subdivide. Okay, everything seems to be fine now. So let's go ahead and create that shape down here. And I'll start by scaling these points in a little bit, and I'm going to move these ones up and also scale them in. And I'm also going to close that polygon hole down there, select the n-gon, and I'm going to start extruding and scaling again. And I'll just do this roughly for now, like before. And let's make sure that the edges, or this polygon down here, is 35 by 35 millimeters. And then I'm going to extrude this down, maybe to about here, and I'll extrude one more time all the way down to the bottom. And I'm going to use extrude inner, and let's maybe do something like this, and I'm going to turn this into a point selection and weld these points. And now we can take these edges here, and I'm going to bevel these. Maybe let's do 2.5 with one subdivision. And let's subdivide and see how that looks, and it seems to be fine. And I'm going to, let's go to edge mode. I'm going to dissolve every other edge here so we can get quads at the bottom. And I'm also going to make the geometry a little more even by adding an edge loop here. So I think that's looking good. And now we can start adjusting the shape a little bit here. And actually down here we're pretty close to what we have in the reference image. Let's start scaling some of the edges here. I'm going to scale this out a little bit. Maybe let's move these points up and also scale them. And I'm also going to scale these. And maybe I'll move these down a little bit further. Yeah, that was not such a good idea. Let's see how that shape looks. It's actually looking pretty good. Like before, we do need more resolution here because we don't have any additional edges between these ones and these ones, so the shape will be distorted if we subdivide this. You can see that this edge up here gets dragged down pretty far. So I'm going to ring select these edges and add a couple of new edge loops using edge cut. So now if I subdivide, everything will stay much closer to the actual shape here. So let's see how that looks. I think we could make this a little bit sharper by moving these points down and scaling them in a little bit. And I'll do the same with these. Just move these down a little bit. Maybe move these ones up and scale them out a little bit. And I'm also going to scale these ones here. And that's looking pretty nice, I think. Now, let's create the geometry for this hole here. I'm going to ring select these edges and connect them, and this should create the edge pretty much at the center of what we have in the reference image here. And I'm going to select these edges and bevel them. Let's do 10 millimeters with one subdivision again. And then I'm just going to add maybe 2 more edge loops here using edge cut, and I'm going to ring select the edges here and also add 2 more edge loops. So we're getting geometry that is pretty evenly spaced apart here. And up here we also need some more geometry. I don't want to go too overboard with this. It is good to have, you know, even geometry and squares, although all of these edges don't really do anything as far as the actual shape is concerned. But it does help with texturing, and if you want to deform the objects. Up here we also need maybe 2 additional edge loops. Okay, so the only thing that's left to do is to put those holes in there. And for the holes I'm going to use a cylinder. We're going to use a bool object. And if you remember, the holes have a diameter of 12 millimeters. So let's change the radius of the cylinder to 6 millimeters and put this to -z. Let's go ahead and move that up, and I'm going to snap it to this edge here, and let's give this 8 rotation segments. And I'm going to make a copy, and I'm going to move that copy up, and let's snap it to this edge here. I'll make one of these cylinders a child of the other, and then I'm going to create a bool object and put those cylinders in there. And let's create a single object. We can keep the edges. And let's go ahead and make that bool object editable. This is our leg. I'm going to delete this selection tag here. And then we can loop select the edges here and the ones down here. And let's do a solid bevel. And let's use maybe 1 millimeter. And that should be enough. Let's go ahead and subdivide this. And that's looking good. And that is our finished leg. Now we can take all the parts that we've modeled so far and assemble our wooden stool. I'm going to assemble our wooden stool in a new file, and I've already created one, and I've also opened the 3 other files with my finished objects, and I'm going to copy each of the objects and move them to my new file here. And I'll just copy these without the subdivision surface objects. For the leg, there's one thing I want to change. Actually, there's a couple of things. For one thing, I want to move the object axis down all the way to the bottom and put the object on the floor. And I also want to make sure that it has the actual height. Although maybe it doesn't matter that much because the subdivision surface object will shrink all of the objects a little bit anyway. I'm going to select the points at the bottom and the ones at the top, and I'm going to move the y-axis all the way to -100%, and I'm going to change the height to 476 millimeters. Maybe let's move these points up a little bit further. I'm going to reset the axis and make our other objects visible again. And I'll start by positioning the pin. And for the pin, I'm going to move the object axis over. Let's reset that all the way on the x-axis. And I need to rotate this 90 degrees. And I'm going to set the axis back to 0. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch on snapping. And I'll move this over, snap it to the center line. And I'm going to use axis extension to snap it to this line. So now it's right where the hole is. And let's go ahead and move this back. Well, actually that's a bad way to do this. Let's start with the, let's put the board into position first. I'm going to rotate this 45 degrees. Let's do plus 45. And I'm going to reset the axis. And then I'm going to move that board up and snap it to the center of the pin. We might as well use it now that we've put it up there. And then what we need to do is we need to move that leg over. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the object axis to this point here, for example. And in the top view, I'm going to move it over and snap it to the edge of the board. And I picked the point on this area here because, as you can see in the top view, the other areas are a little bit bigger. But we need to snap this part here to the geometry of the board. Okay, so that is looking good. And now we can also grab our pin and move that over. And we need to snap the pin to the back of the hole in the board, which is here. So now let's see if we need to change anything. Let's go to the right view here, go to point mode. Yeah. The distance is maybe not quite exact. Or maybe it is. Maybe I snapped the pin to the wrong edge here. I actually didn't. Let's go back to model mode and select that pin. I'll just snap it back to the bottom of that hole. And then I'm just going to select the points here, enable axis, and I'm going to move the axis to this point, switch off enable axis, and I'm going to move all of these points and snap them to the front of our leg here. And then we can create an instance. And I'm going to move the instance up. And I'm going to use axis extension again to snap it to this line here. And we can also make an instance of the board. And let's go ahead and move that up and snap it to here. And then what I'm going to do is I'll make the pins children of the leg. And I'll create a cloner. Let me just check if everything's sitting on the floor. It is. And I'm going to make the leg and its children of the cloner, and I'm going to rename the cloner to leg and pins. I'm going to switch that from linear to radial. We need 4 copies and no radius, and we need to change the plane to XZ. And you can see we're not getting the desired result, but we can easily change that by switching off fix clone. And now everything's in position where it should be. So let's go ahead and select all of the objects, and I'm going to group them. And let's move the object axis to the bottom. And I'm going to call this wooden stool, and let's use a subdivision surface object, and let's rename that. And let's go ahead and add a disk object as a floor. Switch on ambient occlusion. And I'll just do a simple white material I'm going to put on this object here. And let's do a render. Because the object is so small, the ambient occlusion is a bit much. Let's change that to maybe 10 millimeters. Okay, and there we go. That is our finished wooden stool. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you again soon.